I will introduce you. Emra Yildiz is a joint PhD candidate in social anthropology and Middle Eastern studies at Harvard. His research interests include historiography and ethnography of borderlands, anthropology of Islam and pilgrimage, political economy, and contraband commerce, as well as studies of gender and sexuality in the Middle East. He is the co-editor of Resistance Everywhere, Ghazi Protests, and Dissident Visions of Turkey, and he is also the co-editor of Jadaliya's Turkey page. So please welcome Emra.
And I'm very excited to be here and share with you folks some thoughts on the pressing need for principled solidarity between movements of liberation and social justice within the context of the Syrian Revolution. And I'm completely thrilled to learn so much about kind of the points of connection and disconnection between the Palestinian and Kurdish struggles as well. So I'm honored to be joined and with Talal and Maryam as well on this panel, next to Yusuf. So Yusuf kind of set the stage for you folks. My contribution to this discussion is going to be mostly aimed at historicizing the Kurdish political struggle in the context of the broader regional border negotiations and population movements in the post-Ottoman and post-Mandate Levant and Anatolia. In so doing, I want to cast the most recent and extremely fragile alignment of the Kurdish Serhildan, or Intifada in Arabic, or uprising in English, and the Syrian Thawra, as a historical conjuncture, as opposed to a radical novelty, or what, likes of, for instance, Foucault has called the Iranian Revolution a singular event. So I want to kind of question that idea of singularity and trying to kind of situate this in more of a historical framework. But before I continue, and I do so, I want to acknowledge that these conversations still remain rather marginal efforts to alleviate the immense human suffering that the Syrian conflict continues to inflict on all Syrians in and outside of the country. And it has transformed the very language now we use, right? Instead of using this Free Syrian Army, if you look at reporting, it goes to rebels, right? And the Syrian Revolution is taken over by this kind of linguistic shift, and now it has become more of a conflict. I take this to be symptomatic of an internationally and regionally engineered stalling of the Syrian Revolution, that this is actively done, and the perpetual fragmentation and profile targeting of Palestinians and Kurdish populations, I think, lie at the heart of this transformation. And before I now go to the analysis, I want to also have a note of acknowledgement for one who's very dear to my heart, and among all those people who have suffered enormous difficulties during this revolutionary period. One of our friends from Boğaziçi University has fallen in Kobani when he decided to fight instead of write. On October 5th, 2014, we've lost our friend and comrade, our colleague and the sociologist, translator, writer, and revolutionary Supi Nejat Naslı, while he was fighting with the Marxist-Leninist Communist Party of Turkey and North Kurdistan and People's Protection Units in Kobani against ISIL. So this one is for his memory. The historical trajectory of the Turkish political struggle over land, property, and trade in the context of the broader border negotiations and population movements in the post-Ottoman Levant, as I opened with, has to be central, I argue here, to any discussion for the need that we agree on, but the possibilities for principled solidarity between Rojava on the one hand and the Syrian left on the other. I'm going to sketch a collage for you with bits of historical episodes from my research I've conducted, mostly based out of Anteb, so that's right across the border from Syria, but also from Suruç, and I took forays to El Jarablus before things got a lot more unstable there. So my research was between 2012 and 13 when I was in Anteb. And for those of you who are interested in kind of the broader academic scholarship on Kurdish sovereignty struggles, let me flag that I'm going to depart from Ismail Beşikçi's formulation of Kurdistan as an international colony. He's a Kurdish-Turkish sociologist who has been repeatedly pulled into jail, but he kept producing amazing work. And what he means by this is that with the advent of the mandate system, once you get the post-Ottoman geography split up between the British and the French mandates, Kurds are rendered as minorities in 3 distinct areas that were formerly Ottoman territory, right? So I have in mind here Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and of course the 4th part. So Rojava is the west, right? Roj is the sun, the color red. That's the West Kurdistan to Rojahat, which is East Kurdistan in Iran. So that's what he means by not like any other colony. This was basically a continuous geography, right? And Kurds happen to be continue to be the most, the highest number of population with the largest stateless population in the world, basically. Right? And this lies at the heart of these struggles, as well as the connections between places like Mahabad Republic under the Soviet intrusion into Iran to places like Kobani and Rojava today. So before we get to kind of those trans-historical connections between places like Mahabad and Rojava, let me get a little bit into the history of Balad al-Sham and Eastern Anatolia and see how various regimes from the Ottomans to contemporary times have encountered the Kurds. So from 1925 to 1946, while Syria was still a mandate state under French rule, the French have crafted a political infrastructure resting on a classically colonial logic. The country was ruled over from 3 centers with 3 different governmental infrastructures. In the West, the Alawites were in control. And I'm simplifying, and we can unpack these categories, if you like, in the discussion. In the south, the Druze were in control, while Damascus and Aleppo, where Sunnis constitute a majority, were governed through a different set of governmental and political infrastructures, which looked like separate city-states, right? And this actually is a perverse utilization of Ottoman millet system that try to kind of manage diversity and difference in the population. Has gotten out of hand with the Tanzimat reforms under the Ottomans, right? Because they were also turning increasingly more colonial. But these are some of kind of the elements that we'll have to revisit when we're talking about discussions of sectarianism in places from Lebanon to Iraq. So this is how the French managed the situation, right, in Syria. And across the board in all of these governmental infrastructures, however, Kurds remained categorically and practically unrecognized as a community, let alone as a people, because the millet system prefers religious difference, right, over ethnic difference. So particularly if you're Hanafi, right, you're Sunni, as most Kurds were, that was kind of a problem and that was actually an opportunity for the state not to recognize that difference in terms of the millet system. But when the French colonialism came to an end and Syria emerged as an independent and sovereign state in 1946, the situation for the Kurds did not improve, given that Syria's first sovereign administration also refused to recognize the Kurds. Many intellectuals calling for linguistic and cultural rights were arrested and imprisoned. Many more were forced to flee the country. The union of Egypt and Syria under the axis of Arab nationalism between 1958 and 1962 only meant more oppression for the Kurds. Kurds who demanded their rights in Iraq were tortured in Syria. In short, 2 post-Pan-Arab governments, which came into conflict over many other issues, could establish an easy alliance when the question came to the recognition and rights or systematic denial of, or thereof, when it came to the Kurds. In 1962, the Syrian state, by way of a decree, stripped 70,000 Kurds of their Syrian citizenship and subsequently declared them as foreigners living in the country. And we can unpack this too. There are some elements of truth to this story that they're going to utilize, because a lot of Kurds during the Armenian genocide have to flee what is now Turkey, right? So there is a wave of immigration, right? Or asylum, if you want to call it that way, that comes from 15 to late 1920s. That is part of the story of kind of formation of both Turkey and Syria and the denial of Kurdistan in between. Let's go to 1963. That's another important date in Syrian history, the year that the Ba'ath Party came to power through a coup d'etat. The party not only declared Syria as an Arab country, but reiterated the official labeling of Kurds as refugees displaced from Turkey. Based on this latter definition, Kurds have been denied all of their rights. Kurdish identity was banned, and the names of villages and towns were changed. In other words, what Turkey has done in the 1920s and 30s to Kurds, Syria has done basically 40 to 50 years later, with very similar projects of demographic change, replacement, annihilation, and political intimidation. Between 1972 and 1974, thousands of Arabs were moved programmatically by the Ba'ath regime into Kurdish villages in the region of Al Jazeera. This project was actively pursued well into the 2000s after Hafiz Assad died and Bashar al-Assad came to power. Kobani, for instance, and this is really ironic, was renamed as Ain al-Arab, Spring of the Arabs, right, or the Arab Spring, during this period of Arabization and sedentarization of nomadic peoples. So one part of the story there is also the nomadic Arab tribes, right, were part of this kind of general demographic and, dare I say, agricultural and capitalist kind of modernization project that the Syrian state was pursuing. To return to what's under discussion here, though, the principled solidarity and their possibilities, I want to kind of mark the most recent historical episode that needs to be acknowledged that marks this disjuncture between the Kurdish Serhildan and the Syrian Thawra under Bashar, the massacre committed in Qamushlo on March 12, 2004. Kurds, inspired by Saddam's fall, revolted against the Assad regime. With the support of Turkey, and this is well documented, dozens of Kurds were massacred, and they kind of handpicked the political leaders, right? And the Turkish Prime Minister, Erdogan, who has referred to the massacre as incidents and Bashar at the time as his brother, right, congratulated Bashar al-Assad personally for having restored order and control against terrorists. The revolt of March 2004, combined with the ripples of the recent uprisings in the region, were claimed anew on March 15, 2011. And Ahmed Dicle has written about this for those of you who are interested in kind of a larger analysis of the connections between 2004 Qamushlo and 2011. But all those who want to build a democratic Syria in the place of this dictatorial regime, and all those who had problems with the regime on 2011, Ahmed Dicle argues, have to admit that they have been following the process 7 years behind Kurds. So this is an ambitious statement, right? But basically his argument runs saying Kurds have sustained, for over the course of decades, have sustained so much injury from the Syrian regime that they were a lot more organized at the end of the day as a resistant group of dissidents. And what to make of this radical novelty then? If there's this historical connection, there is something radically novel, right, about Kobani, and I'm going to take up those hopefully through your questions. And David Harvey, from David Harvey to David Graeber, a lot of anthropologists and critical geographers have written about this, as well as sociologists like Nazan Üstündağ from Turkey. Oh no, I'm going to intervene, sorry. So I'm going to give you one historical episode to kind of break that radical novelty before we get to the discussions of it. And of course, the parts that highlight that radical novelty for a lot of people is the transformation of PKK, right, from a traditional classical Marxist-Leninist organization to one that is able to accommodate queer and LGBTQ rights, women's rights. In that sense, it's very easily dismissed by kind of crude Marxists, I want to say, on the grounds that they have become compromised, right? But this is, I think, what a lot of people find exciting about Kobani. That's one of the reasons why the women fighters have become such icons in media representations of the Kobani resistance. But what was happening from 1920s until 2004? So here's an episode. In 1990, Osman Sebree wanted to pick himself up from his sickbed in Damascus to greet his guest standing. He was 85 years old and in no condition to walk. His guest was Abdullah Öcalan. He leaned towards his bed and embraced and saluted Sebree. arrested along his uncle during the Sheikh Said rebellion, this is in Turkey, set free and then re-arrested in 1928, Osman Sebree was one of the most prominent Kurdish youth forced to flee Turkey and migrate to Syria under pressure from the Turkish state in 1929. When he arrived in Syria, Sebree joined Khoybun, an organization founded in Beirut by Kurdish intellectuals in exile and very much in solidarity with survivors of the Armenian genocide. A living witness to Kurdish history from 1925 to 1990s, Sebree, also known as Ape Osman, and Öcalan talked about Khoybun for hours on end during Öcalan's visit. At one point in the conversation with Öcalan, tears came to Abe Sebree's eyes, and he told Öcalan, and I'm quoting him, "You're realizing our dreams. I've never been so proud at any time of my life. Now there is an organization possibly to liberate Kurdistan," end of quote. Erdogan, oh my God, Freudian slip. Oh no, where are you? Okay, Öcalan responded in agreement. We're merely following in your footsteps. This time we will prevail, end of quote. 3 years after this conversation, Osman Sebree passed away at the age of 88. Ape Osman now rests in the Berkever graveyard, a village administratively tied to Dirbesiye. On either side is flanked by his fellow travelers, Mele and Melikete Tumok of Batman on the one side, and Rüstü Cudi, one of the most prominent leaders of contemporary Kurdish movement, on the other. A large Keskesork flag flutters over the graveyard. PKK leader Abdullah Öcalan crossed from Suruç, this is in Şanlıurfa, Turkey, to Kobani in July 1979, and stayed there for a while en route to Damascus and Beirut, where he would spend the next 20 years of his life. During this period, Öcalan also visited Aleppo regularly and established intense relations with the Rojava Kurds in Al Jazeera as well. According to the official statements of the PKK, between 1980 and 2012, approximately 5,000 women and men from Rojava lost their lives on PKK fronts. This points to the close connection between Rojava Kurds and the PKK. With Öcalan leaving the region in 1999, after the so-called Adana Treaty, which initiated state-level collaboration regarding the Kurdish issue between Turkey and Syria, the space for maneuver for the PKK was practically abolished in Syria. Many PKK militants were captured and returned to Turkey by Syrian authorities. This also happens to be the time where Syria finally dropped all of its territorial claims over Antioch that was illegally annexed by Turkey in 1937. So when the Syrian Revolution began, Kurds in Syria had a huge advantage over others. I would agree with Ahmet Dicle in this sense. They were organized, they were connected across the border to other Kurds in basically Western Kurdistan and Turkey's Kurdistan, and they knew very well how to get organized. Kurds met the dawn of the Syrian Revolution starting on March 15, 2011, prepared. Instead of pursuing a populist political strategy, the Kurds in Syria have opted for one that took social participation at its point of departure. They adopted sustainable long-term tactics as opposed to pragmatic ones that changed daily. That's why since July 19, 2012, from Kobani to Derik, in 9 cities and dozens of districts and towns and villages, they have succeeded in initiating and building people's revolutions. This is not a direct operation of the PKK, as some might claim, but this is also not to say that the PKK is oblivious or external to these developments. The PKK might not be there organically or organizationally, but its spirit lives on the political, military, and social practices of the people. And Öcalan ideas are pretty much the basis of this. But as I try to show you here today, those ideas are actually much older, right? They don't just come out of the blue in 60s or 70s, as it's usually assumed, but they're actually dating back to 1920s. And now I want to break, just by way of conclusion, the idea of the monolithic Kurdish movement that everyone is Marxist-Leninist, this and that and the other. That's actually not the case, as you can imagine. There's a huge wide spectrum in the political sense between Hüdapar, which is a Hezbollah-like religious formation that is the strongest in Van and Diyarbakir, so that's Turkey's Kurdistan, but they have networks into Syria as well. And then there are basically 3, since the 1990s, main strands of political struggle. let's say, they're normally associated with the leaders, right? Öcalan, Barzani, and Talabani. And Barzani family is behind actually the Mahabad Republic in 1940s in Iran because they needed military support, and the military support came from Iraq to help build the republic in Iran. So the same kind of dynamics in a certain sense. Of course, it's not history as tragedy and farce, but there's certain historical connections that Iraq serves between Rojava and Rojahat that needs to be, again, part of the conversation. And what were the Kurds doing when the Syrian liberation front, or let's say the oppositionary forces were less fragmented? Everyone basically formed that were part of the Kurdish National Council of Syria. These were 16 political parties. There was only one that did not sign on to this, and they emerged as the most strong one, or the strongest one. It's the Partiye Yakutiye Demokrat, the Democratic Union Party of Syria, or PYD. And they are normally credited as the ones who were able to reconcile, let's say, feminist, queer, and Marxist-Leninist politics that marks the radical novelty of a place like Rojava, but it also shows a certain kind of ignorance to a certain extent in terms of what the other Syrians had to go through. And these have historical precedences. For me, that is the contour of the limits of solidarity between the Kurdish movement and the larger Syrian left. And I wish that I could be a little bit more hopeful. And we can talk about how Kobani has been framed and what I see as coming out of that. But I think for any kind of principled solidarity to emerge between the Kurdish and the Syrian left, kind of like what has been sort of happening in Turkey, although I'm not, super hopeful about that too. Kind of like what the Turkish left had to do, the Syrian left has to open up to all these atrocities that the Kurds had to endure between these two nationalist projects. And before the Syrian and Turkish left can do that, I don't think that there's a possibility of Kurds, Turks, and Arabs forming a coalition that is really committed to social justice. Thank you.